The gates creaked open, and a foul, suffocating smell hit us before we even stepped inside. Death, hunger, and despair all mixed into one. What I saw next didn't look human anymore. 5,000 American soldiers, nothing but skin and bone, barely holding on to life inside that German camp. For a moment, even the air felt frozen. Then George S. Patton turned toward me, his face hard, eyes burning with something I had never seen before, and in a cold, controlled voice, he gave me an order so terrifying, it changed everything in that instant. My name is James Walker. I had been with 3rd Army's Medical Corps long enough to know that Colonel Hartford did not panic. In 9 months of following Patton across France, Luxembourg, and into the heart of Germany, I had watched Hartford receive casualty reports that would have broken a lesser man. He read them the way a carpenter reads a level, steady, calibrated, adjusting without drama. So when Hartford walked into our forward aid station on the morning of April 5th, 1945, and his face looked the way it did, I put down what I was doing. He said, "Walker, we have a situation." Those 4 words were the beginning of the most important 36 hours of my life. I want to tell you what we found behind that wire, because I think most people who read about it in history books encounter numbers. 200 prisoners, 98 pounds average body weight, scurvy, pellagra, tuberculosis, frostbite. These numbers are accurate. I helped compile some of them, but numbers do not prepare you for the moment you walk through a gate and a man reaches for your hand. He was an American soldier. He had been a soldier anyway. What he was in that moment was a question mark wearing the remnants of a uniform. His grip was weak in a way that had nothing to do with weakness of character. His body had simply run out of the raw material required to produce strength. He looked at my uniform. He looked at the red cross on my arm. And he said, "You came. Not you're here. Not thank God. Just you came." I have thought about those 2 words almost every day for the last 80 years, because embedded in them is an entire history of waiting, of not knowing if anyone was coming, of surviving one more day, not because survival felt possible, but because stopping felt like surrender. He had kept himself alive on the probability that someone might come. And then someone did. Let me give you the context that I did not fully have in April 1945, but that I have assembled across the decades since. 3rd Army had been moving at a pace that the Germans had calculated was operationally impossible. They had done their math in February. Their math was wrong. By April, Patton's forces were advancing between 15 and 25 miles per day across central Germany, against rearguard resistance over difficult terrain, with supply lines stretched to the absolute edge of what logistics officers could sustain. That speed was intentional. Patton believed that velocity was protection, that a fast army was harder to kill, harder to counter, and harder to predict than a slow one. He had built 3rd Army around this belief. Every formation, every supply system, every command structure was optimized for speed. What no one had fully calculated, including Patton, was what that speed would find when it outran the German capacity to manage what they were leaving behind. What they were leaving behind was us. American soldiers, British soldiers, French, Soviet, and other Allied personnel. Tens of thousands of men distributed across a network of camps that had been designed for permanence in a Reich that no longer had any permanence to offer. When the German administrative system began to collapse in the final weeks, it collapsed fastest at the perimeter. Guards fled, supply lines to the camps evaporated. The men inside those gates received what the German administration felt like providing, which in the final months was as close to nothing as you can get, while technically maintaining a pulse. I have read the German testimony. Captured officers asked about conditions in the camps in those final months said the same thing in different languages. They knew. The word kept appearing in interrogation reports. They knew. The knowing did not produce the action. When Patton arrived at Ohrdruf on April 12th, he brought Eisenhower and Bradley with him. He had specifically communicated the day before that they needed to see it. Not read a report, see it. Eisenhower vomited. Bradley stood without speaking for several minutes. Patton moved through the facility with the controlled velocity of a man conducting a tactical assessment. He was already calculating. I was not at Ordruff when Patton arrived. I was at a different facility, one of the smaller ones, working with a team of 4 other medical personnel to process what we were encountering. We had been doing this for 18 hours. We had not slept. We had not eaten, because every time one of us thought about eating, we looked around and stopped thinking about it. The men we were treating had entered German captivity weighing between 155 and 175 pounds. The average body weight I was documenting was 98 pounds. Some were lower. I am going to let that number sit for a moment, because it did not feel like a number when I was looking at it. It felt like a verdict. A verdict on every assumption I had made about what civilized nations did and did not do to prisoners of war. These were not men who had been caught in a legitimate military food shortage. These were men who had been deliberately starved, systematically, across months, with documentation going up the German command chain to people who received reports and filed them and issued bureaucratic language about prisoners not being allowed to fall into American hands in conditions that would provide propaganda material. Propaganda material. The men I was treating were not propaganda material. They were my countrymen. They were somebody's sons. They were 20-year-old kids from Kansas and Georgia and Pennsylvania who had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and had survived 4 months in German captivity by consuming whatever calories their captors had chosen to provide, which by February and March of 1945 was approaching 0. I was in the middle of my 18th consecutive hour of work when the runner arrived. He had a written order. It was signed by Colonel Hartford. It cited, in the formal bureaucratic language that military orders require, General George S. Patton's direct instruction. And it said words that I have never forgotten, because they were the most clarifying professional instruction I have ever received in my life. The order said, "You will find the capacity." Let me explain what those 4 words meant in practical terms, because the practical terms are the story. 3rd Army's Medical Corps in April 1945 was operating at documented capacity limits. We had been managing combat casualties for 9 months. The system was designed for a specific throughput. We had been running at or above that throughput for most of those 9 months. Every medical officer in 3rd Army knew the numbers. Every medical officer knew that the system was full. Patton had looked at that system and added to its load without ceremony and without asking whether the capacity existed. He told Hartford to find it. Hartford told us. What this meant in practice was that we were not permitted to perform assessments of the liberated prisoners. An assessment is a military medical procedure. You evaluate, you document, you categorize, you determine the appropriate level of care and refer accordingly. An assessment is organized. An assessment takes time. Patton had removed time from the equation. What we were ordered to perform instead was immediate stabilization. You will treat the man in front of you. You will do it now. You will not wait for the capacity to exist. You will create the capacity by treating the man in front of you and then treating the man behind him. I had 3 months of combat medical experience. I had never encountered refeeding syndrome, which is the medical crisis that occurs when a severely malnourished body receives nutrition it can no longer properly process. In April 1945, neither had most of the medical staff around me. We learned the term later. What we encountered in real time was men dying within hours of receiving the food that should have saved them. 847 men died in the first 72 hours following liberation in 3rd Army's zone. These were men who had survived German captivity. They had survived the deliberate starvation, the forced marches in January and February at -12 degrees Fahrenheit with no food and no shelter, covering 15 to 30 miles per day. They had survived all of that. And then they died within 3 days of rescue because their bodies had been too damaged by systematic deprivation to survive the nutritional intervention that was their only remaining chance. I was there for some of those deaths. I was holding the hand of one of those men when he died. I did not have the medical knowledge in that moment to fully understand what was happening. I understood that I was losing him. I understood that I had done everything I knew how to do. I understood that the gap between what I knew and what was required was a gap that had been created not by my inadequacy, but by 6 months of deliberate German administrative neglect. When Hartford received the preliminary mortality report and brought it to Patton, Patton did not revise his orders. He accelerated them. I did not understand this at the time. I was in the field. I did not know what Patton had decided. I only felt the downstream effect of it, which was that the resources coming into our position increased. More supplies, more personnel, more food, commandeered from German warehouses and farms within 20 miles of every liberated camp by Patton's quartermaster units, who had been ordered to take what was needed and deliver it immediately. Allied military government doctrine at the time required a systematic inventory of German civilian resources before any requisition. Patton had skipped the inventory. Someone apparently asked about the legal framework for this. Patton's documented response, recorded by his aide, was that the law would catch up to the need or get out of the way. The food arrived. Here is what I want you to understand about those days, because I think it gets lost in the historical summaries. We were not performing humanitarian work as a pause from the war. The war was still happening. Third Army was still advancing. German formations were still fighting rearguard actions across the same operational zone where we were treating liberated prisoners. The machinery of combat was running at full speed, and Patton had inserted a second demand into that machinery without reducing the first. He had done it because he had decided that both things were military priorities of equal urgency. I did not have the intellectual framework in April 1945 to understand what I was watching. I was too close to it. I was too tired. I was too overwhelmed by the specific weight of the specific men in front of me. What I understand now, having spent 8 decades thinking about it, is this. Patton believed that armies are made of human beings. He believed this not as sentiment, but as operational logic. He had built Third Army around the premise that the care of human beings was not a distraction from military effectiveness, but the precondition for it. When he walked through those gates and saw what German administration had produced, he was not encountering something foreign to his professional framework. He was encountering the ultimate consequence of discarding that framework entirely. And he responded the only way he knew how to respond to any problem that required immediate action. He treated it as a logistics problem. He moved supply lines. He activated medical structures. He issued non-negotiable orders. He did not make speeches about the moral weight of what he was witnessing, although the moral weight was obvious to everyone present, including him. He did not pause to express the appropriate emotional responses, although those responses existed. He had already made the moral calculation before he arrived. It was finished. What remained was operational. Compassion without organization is theater. Theater does not save lives. He organized. On April 14, 1945, Patton issued a written directive requiring the mayors of every German town within operational proximity of a liberated camp to personally tour the facility, not to send a representative, to attend themselves, to see what had been done in their names or at minimum within their administrative jurisdiction. Several of those officials requested that armed guards accompany them on the tour. The requests were denied. Patton's written response to one such request is preserved in the Third Army Command records. It reads in its entirety, "No. I heard about this order while I was still in the field. The response among the medical personnel I was working with was complicated. Some found it satisfying. Some found it beside the point. We had too much work in front of us to spend significant time processing the emotional valence of German mayors being walked through facilities that our patients had spent months trying to survive." But I understood what Patton was doing, even then. He was ensuring that the knowing could never again be separated from the seeing. He was removing the bureaucratic insulation that allows institutions to commit atrocities by ensuring that no one person is directly responsible for the entire chain of consequences. He was making people look. The documentation he ordered compiled went to SHAEF, to the War Department in Washington, to the International Red Cross in Geneva, and to accredited press correspondents embedded with Third Army. The photographic and statistical record became primary source material for the Nuremberg war crimes proceedings that began in November 1945. Justice Robert H. Jackson cited Third Army's documentation in his opening statement as among the most systematically collected evidence of its kind available to the tribunal. That documentation had been collected by a combat army whose primary mission was the destruction of German military resistance. Patton had made it happen anyway, in the same 36 hours in which he was managing an active advance across central Germany. The German officers who were later asked about this said the same thing repeatedly in different interrogation rooms to different American intelligence personnel. They had not expected it. Their professional consensus had been that American forces in the final advance would be focused on military targets. They had not expected a three-star general to treat the documentation of a humanitarian atrocity as a tactical objective with the same urgency as the seizure of a Rhine crossing. They had underestimated the speed. They always underestimated the speed. Private First Class Donald Caldwell of the 28th Infantry Division had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. He was liberated from Stalag 9B on April 10, 1945. I did not treat Caldwell personally, but his account, recorded in 2003 and held in the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, says something that I have returned to more times than I can count. He was asked what he remembered about the moment of liberation. He described the arrival of American forces this way: "They didn't just open the gate, they came in. That is the whole story. That is Patton's order translated into human consequence. You could open a gate and stand at the perimeter. You could issue a report. You could document the conditions and forward the documentation to the appropriate command authority and wait for the system to process the information and generate the appropriate institutional response. That would be following procedure. That would be entirely defensible under the applicable military regulations of April 1945. Patton came in. He ordered his army to come in with him. He ordered medical teams in. He ordered supplies in. He ordered accountability in the form of counterintelligence teams, hunting the guards who had fled, who were apprehended in the weeks following liberation and held for the war crimes documentation process. Between April 5th and May 8th, Third Army's counterintelligence teams apprehended 215 individuals identified by former prisoners as camp personnel. He ordered the documentation in. He ordered the mayors in, personally, without armed escorts, to see what their administrative proximity had produced, and he ordered a 23-year-old kid from Ohio into a liberated camp with the instruction that I would find the capacity. I did find it. I do not say that with pride exactly. Pride implies that it was difficult in a way that reflects credit on the person who did it. What I found the capacity to do was simply to keep working, to treat the man in front of me and then the man behind him, to learn in real time as Hartford's protocols adjusted across 48 hours in response to the mortality patterns we were seeing, that refeeding required different nutritional approaches than we had initially applied. To make the adjustments, to continue. 847 men died in the first 72 hours. Those deaths stayed with me. They will stay with me until I stop staying anywhere. But Third Army's liberated prisoner recovery rate in the first 30 days following liberation was 94.3%. The theater-wide average across all Allied liberating forces was 89.1%. The 5.2 percentage point gap represents, in absolute numbers, approximately 680 additional survivors out of Third Army's liberated population. 680 people who are alive because the response was faster, better organized, and more aggressively resourced than the theater average. 680 people who went home. I have done the math on this more times than I can count, not to make myself feel better, not to construct a narrative in which the tragedy has a redemptive arc that erases the losses. 847 men died. That number does not get smaller because 680 others survived who might not have. Both things are true simultaneously. That is the arithmetic of catastrophe. You measure what you saved and you carry what you lost, and you do not permit either number to cancel the other. I'm going to tell you the principle I took from those 36 hours, because I have spent the rest of my life testing it in every domain I have worked in, and it has never failed to be true. Urgency without organization is panic. Organization without urgency is bureaucracy. The only thing that saves lives, in war, in medicine, in every crisis that has ever demanded a response, is the capacity to be both simultaneously. Patton was both. Every time. That was what made him terrifying to his enemies, and occasionally to his allies, and fairly often to his subordinates. He had no tolerance for urgency that dissolved into chaos, and no tolerance for organization that calcified into delay. He wanted the thing done, and he wanted it done right, and he wanted it done now, and the tension between those three demands was not a problem to be resolved. It was the condition under which effective action occurred. When Hartford came to me and said we have a situation, and handed me an order that said I would find the capacity, he was transmitting that principle directly from Patton through the chain of command to a 23-year-old kid who did not yet have the intellectual framework to name what he was receiving. I have the framework now. What Patton gave me in that order was not a demand that exceeded my capabilities. It was a refusal to let me define my capabilities by what they had been before the problem arrived. He was not asking me to do what I had done before. He was telling me that what I had done before was not the ceiling, that the ceiling was wherever the need was, that my job was not to measure the distance between the need and my previous capacity and report back on the shortfall. My job was to close the distance. I closed it. Not because I was exceptional, because the order was clear, the stakes were visible, and the man in front of me had 2 words left in whatever reserve he had been surviving on. You came. The least I could do was come all the way in. Thank you for watching. If you were moved by this powerful World War II story and want more untold moments of courage, leadership, and the harsh realities of war, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these stories to life. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in that moment? And how would you have reacted to the order given by George S. Patton after discovering 5,000 starving American POWs in that German camp? See you in the next story.